Hey y'all.
What's up, everybody? Thanks for being here with us as always on this. I don't know where y'all are, but for me, it's a beautiful, quite warm New England Monday. So
It is hot. Y'all, it's like 80 degrees here. Like
it's here.
y'all think, y'all think I be playing about this climate change thing and us not being long for this earth. It is literally late October. It is 80 degrees in Detroit, Michigan. That is not normal.
It is not, indeed. It's not normal, but it's good for my mental health.
Listen, we need a little tit for tat. Little column A, little column B.
Oh god.
So we're just waiting for one more person, y'all. We got 2 of our 3 guests here.
2 of our heavy hitters.
2 of our heavy hitters. In case you have not, if you didn't see our social media posts, we're doing like a bit of a roundtable today, talking about a number of linked issues, especially the blackout in Cuba, Africom or BAP's month of international action against Africom, and then talking about the repression of African Stream again. And then we're just gonna have a conversation from there. So that is what we doing.
And because of that, we will do our, our personal check-ins and our other stuff. We'll kind of do that in reverse order because we want to take advantage of the time we have with our folks today. Excuse me.
What's up with y'all? Let's see. All right. Well, you know what? Maybe we can just introduce our 2 guests that we have here, and then
what
bring them up. Yeah, and then add in. So we were initially going to have Julie Verghese, but unfortunately, she is ill, wasn't able to make it. So we got Salifu Mack to agree to come on and talk about African Stream. So hopefully he'll be pulling up soon. But now I'm going to add Manolo de los Santos and Jackie Lukman. Hey, y'all.
What's going on?
Woo, I'm so excited. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to be among all of my favorite, smart, thinking Africans. Thank y'all for existing.
Of course.
So I do not feel like I am losing my mind all being surrounded by idiots. I just
listen.
That's definitely a thing. Yes. And Jackie, so, we get a double take. We got to see each other twice in the past 2 weeks, even though other folks won't necessarily see it for a while. But
well, that's okay. I'll take it because man, I thought about that conversation for a couple of days. I was like, dang,
it was a really good conversation. Great. It was.
So I've got high hopes for this conversation. So don't let me down, Manolo. Don't.
I will try my best.
All right, y'all. So let me go ahead and read the bios of the 2 people we have here so far. And then we could just go ahead and get started with our portion of the conversation that is like directed to each individual. So Jackie Lukman is a Pan-Africanist, internationalist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist organizer, journalist, author, and metalhead. We call her the People's Prophetess, and she is here to carry on the legacy of the late Abdus Lukman. And Manolo de los Santos is a popular educator and organizer from the Caribbean. He is committed to the radical transformation of the world at the hands of the poor and oppressed. Versed in histories of struggle and methodologies of education, Manolo seeks to engage a new generation of visionaries and fighters. For 10 years, he's worked in the Organization of Solidarity and Education programs to change the United States regime of illegal sanctions and blockades. Based out of Cuba for many years, Manolo has worked toward building international networks of people's movements and organizations. In 2018, he became the founding director of the People's Forum in New York City, a movement incubator for working class communities to build unity across historic lines of division at home and abroad. And he is also a collaborative researcher with Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. So thank you all. Thank you both for being here today.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. I think, there are so many things that connect the things that we hope to talk about today. But we wanted to kind of start off by letting you all both kind of have a few minutes to talk through what you see are some of the kind of most pressing things in terms of the issues we asked you to come on and speak about today. So I think, Jackie, perhaps we'll start with you. So as a member of Black Alliance for Peace, you are coming on to help us understand more about what the International Month of Action Against Africom is. So can you talk to us about the campaign and some of the important ways BAP is raising awareness about Africom, and also why it's important to shut Africom down?
Yeah, so I have to be honest, before I became a member of BAP back in 2017, pretty much when it started, I had never heard of Africom before, didn't know anything about it. And I think the vision of Ajamu Baraka and the people who founded BAP was that we should know about Africom because it is vitally important to continuing to maintain the system of now neo-colonial imperialist control on the continent. So I learned right along with the campaign, because the Shutdown Africom campaign was the first campaign of the Black Alliance for Peace. And it is an enduring campaign because of the enduring, very negative, harmful, and deadly legacy of Africom. So I learned right along with everybody else in BAP that Africom, which was started in October of 2007, or rather October of 2008, after the Heritage Foundation wrote a paper, a concept paper called U.S. Military Assistance for Africa, a better solution. That concept paper that came from the Heritage Foundation was basically the founding principles, the founding document of Africom that was established under George W. Bush in 2007, expanded by over 1,000%. Africom was by Barack Obama during his administration. And usually when we do teach-ins on Africom, we get to that point in the brief history of Africom, and we see the faces of people around the room like, oh, Obama did that? Yes, Barack Obama expanded Africom by over 1,000%, which always leads to the question, well, what does Africom do? Why should we be concerned about it? And why should we care that Obama extended Africom or expanded Africom the way he did? Because the real purpose of Africom, that the US government and the imperialists and the neo-colonialists that Africom protects, will tell you that Africom exists to combat terrorism on the continent, the spread of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism on the continent. But if you go back to the history, these terrorists, so-called terrorist organizations, either didn't exist before 9/11, or if they did, they were so inconsequential that they didn't have any money, they didn't have any material support, so they didn't really have that much of an impact. But just like what the U.S. did in arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union, and we know that the Mujahideen transformed themselves into the Taliban, supported and propped up by the United States. That is the same kind of situation with these so-called Islamic terrorist groups on the continent of Africa. They were propped up by the US government at the same time that Africom was implemented and grew. So the US government is involved in creating the situation that they claim they need to respond to with military force, and then entrenching and expanding the situation, making it worse for the people in order to justify US expansion of militarism in that area. So why do this? Because as the old adage says, folks, whoever controls Africa controls the world. That has been the imperialistic understanding or the nature of the relationship between Africa and the imperialist powers in the world. The first imperialist power that we're talking about in relation to Africa is obviously Europe, and their carving up of the continent for their benefit, but the intentional underdevelopment and the theft, the underdevelopment of the human resources and of the material resources of the continent, but also the theft of the resources and the oppression of the people in order to mine and process those resources. But of course, the people don't benefit from their labor, right? Because they're forced to do it. So Africom exists for the United States to maintain the control of African resources by the West, by not just the United States, but all of its European and NATO partners. So Africom's expansion under Obama was not to protect African people from Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, but it's to keep African people subjugated so the US and its friends can continue to rape the continent, exploit the people, and steal their resources. Because if the people on the continent had control over their resources, they would definitely do something different with their resources that would benefit them, as opposed to what's going on now, where we have a situation where the entire world basically needs all of the resources from Africa. Probably, I think it's around 45% of the resources, the material resources, the ore, the metals, the precious materials, diamonds, golds, and that type of thing that's in the ground in Africa. Oh, sorry. He does not like loud noise.
He said, No, he said he don't like colonialism. He don't like imperialism.
He mad. He's like, they're doing what? But basically, Africom exists to continue to steal those resources from the rest of the world, because if the African people had control of those resources, they'd be fine with France being dark. You understand? If the Africans controlled, if the Nigerians controlled their uranium, they would be fine with France figuring out a different way to keep their lights on, because they would be able to actually have electricity for all of the people, right? So Africom exists to maintain this colonized, settler, colonist, oppressed people relationship between the continent of Africa and the rest of the so-called developed world. But the developed world is controlled by the imperialist powers, and their development only happened because they raped and stole from Africa. And Africom exists to maintain that relationship. So we in BAP say that our people have to know this, because that relationship is the exact same relationship that we in this country have with this government that is using Africom to do the same thing to our relatives on the continent, and honestly, the rest of the world.
Yes, thank you so much, Jackie. That is such an awesome overview of Africom. And we should just mention, Africom is just one of these many command structures that encircle the globe. Oh, and space. There's also SpaceCom. So it's Africom is just one manifestation of the US's hell-bent nature on controlling the entire world. But let me introduce our third panelist, who actually is going to speak next, because Salifu unfortunately can't be with us the whole time. So we want all of the energy and information from our comrade as we can get. So this is Salifu Mack, a Pan-Africanist and organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the Low Country Action Committee in the Low Country of South Carolina. He is also a public school teacher and a former reporter at African Stream. So on that note, Salifu, this is precisely what we want to ask you about. We want to ask you about if you can tell us what it was like to work at African Stream, first of all, and your thoughts on the repression the platform is facing by the U.S. government, and then what you think are some of the effects of this particular targeting, especially for African people and radical Africans.
For sure. Thank y'all for having me. I want to apologize in advance for how I look. It's Spirit Week this week, so the day was tacky day. And then, of course, y'all will have a conversation where I got to come on camera this week today. But so you asked about what it was like to work at African Stream. So I'll start by saying this. I was able to work at African Stream for the past year. I was making a transition from the U.S. to Burkina Faso. In terms of synchronicity, it like worked out. It was a perfect sort of opportunity for me. I say all the time that working at African Stream was probably one of the more satisfying journalistic career, like jobs that I've had. I kind of started my career as a producer and a reporter in mainstream media, in corporate media. And so I've had a lot of experiences where there are stories that I'm passionate about and I'm pitching them to editors who care absolutely nothing about what it is that I want to talk about, or I am pitching things that they're accepting, but then my work is getting like edited to hell. And the purpose of the story is being entirely, you know, revamped, removed. The teeth, the bite, and all of these things are being brought out of it. And I didn't find that to be my experience at African Stream at all. What I found was like an alignment in my personal interests and values at the company. I was allowed a lot of free reign, I guess you could say, to pursue stories, pursue moments in history, and bring those things to the forefront, and was given a lot of support by a really wonderful team, which is based and operating out of Africa almost entirely. I'll say there are very few people who work at African Stream who are not directly based in Africa, with those people being primarily like in the UK, and that's maybe 3 people at the most. But the African Stream office is located in Nairobi, Kenya, and that's where the team of producers, video editors, a lot of the editors that I was receiving feedback on scripts and posts and things like that are based out of. And African Stream for me meant a lot, but African Stream for them is everything, because these kinds of career opportunities where you're able to, as an African person, tell stories about Africa in an with an anti-imperialist lens, with an pan-Africanist lens, is not even very common on the African continent. Just being honest with you, that we understand that that's the nature of sort of the neo-colonial states that, you know, comprise our continent right now. And so I was really proud to work at African Stream. I was really proud of the stories that we were able to create. Every Thursday, we would have these staff meetings where the entire team in Kenya would get together in one room, and then it would be like me and Inem in Burkina Faso, and then some of the folks in the UK, and we would throw ideas at each other. We argued a lot because y'all know Africans love to argue. So everybody had a difference of opinion on things. We gave each other positive feedback on the stories that we had worked on for the week. It was a really gratifying experience, and it was also, I found, to be very sort of intellectually stimulating and challenging, especially for me as diaspora, because there will be often times where I would have certain perspectives that I wanted to bring to stories, and my perspective was skewed, or I guess sort of could only exist in the context of the experiences that I had. And so it was very humbling sometimes to get feedback on scripts based on certain language that I was using, or based on certain angles that I wanted to pursue on stories, to hear from other continental brothers and sisters who share similar belief systems and have been working in media longer or as long as I did, to say, hey, have you considered approaching your story from this perspective? Or have you considered trying to track down this kind of voice to help tell the story? So I guess in short, that's kind of what my experience was at African Stream. It had absolutely nothing to do with Russia. It had absolutely nothing to do with Iran, which are both places that, you know, I feel are very important in the global anti-imperialist struggle right now. And I take nothing from them and to denigrate them at all. But my experience as a journalist at African Stream was entirely predicated on the work and the assistance of other Africans.
So where do you think that narrative came from? Like, where did the whole Russian RT front come from? Where did that, why was that targeted at African Stream?
You know, I will never have a way to 100% confirm or deny what I believe, because the U.S. State Department made these accusations against us with absolutely no merit, with no evidence. And unfortunately, due to sort of the nature of the global world order, they will never have to provide a rationalization for the claims that they leveraged against us. But I'm almost certain personally that it has a lot to do with African Stream's coverage of the Sahel in this current moment. I think that African Stream was giving voice in like a very sort of on the ground way to the current developments. Oh, can't have this. To current developments that are occurring inside of Burkina Faso. We were covering. ENEM had been traveling to Mali, to Niger, still currently, and so you're seeing firsthand on the ground, sort of people on mic talking about why they're not going to be turned against Russia in this moment. Talking about, giving real geopolitical commentary, and sort of, I guess, that lived experience narrative into how they are perceiving changes in the security situation at this moment, where France has been completely removed from the country, and how things are trending with the security partnership with Russia. This is bad news. This is bad news for the U.S. State Department. It's bad news for their allies in Paris, because you can say anything like online. You can kick up any kind of like fake bot sort of social media campaigns that you want. We see they try to do it all the time with Cuba. We see they try to do it all the time with Haiti. But to have reporters on the ground who are like in these countries talking to what you call, your everyday people, and not just like the radicals or the terrorists, and hearing these perspectives was very threatening to the narrative that I think that they wanted to build. And so I think the easiest way to take down what we were doing was to come behind us and say, well, obviously, like, Russia's paying for this.
No, I think that's really important context. And I think even when you were telling us that the way you all would decide on stories, right, is literally like a weekly staff meeting where you're tossing ideas and some of them are getting thrown down, to really dispel this notion that somehow this is being imposed from the outside, again, as if we cannot think for ourselves. And I think that is, an interesting and important segue to the question that we want to also ask Manolo, to bring him into the conversation, right? So at the moment, Cuba is undergoing really a kind of unprecedented blackout because of the power failure of one of the central grids on the island, and on top of that are facing Hurricane Oscar sort of coming in, right? And despite the fact that Cuba historically has one of the best hurricane preparedness systems in the country, there are obviously, not in the country, in the world, there are obviously limitations to what, can and cannot be done when people can't necessarily communicate with one another if the power grid is down. So we wanted to ask you, Manolo, to sort of talk a little bit more about what's happening in Cuba related to the blockade, obviously the long ongoing blockade, and the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, and how that designation is really sort of directly not just related to, but is really an underlying cause of what is happening at this moment in Cuba.
Well, thank you for having me on. And I think the corporate media has been so focused on this question of the blackout and painting it as a failure of the Cuban government. The Cuban government is a failed state. That's their favorite catchword now. But I think there's a deeper story that we should be talking about, which is that for us as anti-imperialists, even though we see signs of hope in the world, we see multipolarity, BRICS is meeting next week in Russia, but the reality is that US imperialism is on the offensive around the world. And they are in a war that in many places looks violent and has bullets and bombs, like in Gaza right now. But there are places where the bombs and the bullets are silent and are harder to see. That is the case of Cuba, a country where for over 60 years, 62 to be exact, there has been the most cruel blockade in place. And in 2018, to be more specific, because of Cuba's solidarity with Venezuela, because of the fact that Cuba had sent over 30,000 doctors and teachers, gym teachers, many of them, to work in the barrios, in the poorest neighborhoods of Caracas and many parts of Venezuela, where The bourgeois doctors and teachers didn't want to go. Because of that, Trump placed sanctions directly on Cuba's state-owned companies that transport fuel, that purchase spare parts around the world. Basically, the US was intentionally trying to create the situation that Cuba has now. A situation where its infrastructure is deteriorated, or a situation where Cuba literally has no fuel to operate its electrical power grid, and a reality where people's demands, because of climate change, people's demand to use electricity grows by the week. It created the perfect storm. So there's a blackout for over 3 days. And again, Cuba's a failed state. Cuba doesn't know what it's doing. And I just found out maybe like a minute before we started this program that our, I don't even know how to refer to her because I don't feel she has the honor to be called Haitian, but the spokeswoman for the White House made a statement just now saying that the US has no responsibility at all, has no responsibility for the blackout in Cuba, and that, the Cubans haven't asked for any assistance or any help, so therefore there's nothing that the US can say or do. The first thing is that Cubans are not asking for help. Cubans are just asking to lift that goddamn blockade. Lift it so that the Cuban people can solve their own problems. I mean, already, as we speak, 85% of people in Havana have electricity again. But this is because of the sweat and the blood and the creativity and the ingenuity of the Cuban people to find solutions where there are none. They're patching up all parts and putting them into the system. They're using many alternative sources of energy to try to patch up the national grid. And it's like this crazy effort. The Cubans are like superhumans at this point, trying to survive. But their story is not unique or exceptional. There are pockets of resistance around the world, from Cuba to the Sahel, from Sahel to China and Russia, that are being stamped out by the US because they don't want any dissent. And it's curious. You have this country that considers itself the most important democracy in the world, but it doesn't tolerate any difference of opinion. It doesn't tolerate anyone who wants to run their country as they see fit. And for as long as countries like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Niger, and many others, in China and Russia and Iran, choose to wake up every morning with an ounce of dignity, the US will continue to maintain these evil sanctions that are meant to break their backs into submission. I'm glad you brought up, I think that's the Mallory Memorandum.
Mm-hmm.
Where it states so clearly, they plan the deprivation, the suffering, the hunger of the Cuban people so that the Cuban people are forced to overthrow the government. Well, guess what? As much as US paid agents were advocating for overthrowing of the Cuban government for the last 3 nights, when I woke up this morning, the Cuban government was still in place. The Cuban Revolution was still standing. Why? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, beyond the question of even socialism, most Cubans prefer to be independent and poor than to be a colony and live under the wealth of the United States.
What did Sekou Touré say? He said we prefer dignity in poverty than riches in chains, right? And I wanted to bring up this document. Many people may already be familiar with it, but I think what it shows us is really the blueprint for what we see in terms of how the U.S. operates in trying to break the will of the people of countries that have decided to go against the global capitalist tide, the global imperialist tide, right? That these sanctions, these blockades are literally designed to make life so unbearable for the people of these respective countries, be it Cuba, be it Venezuela, and as we move forward, be it Niger, be it Burkina Faso, right? That this is essential in the U.S. playbook and how it is that they create a state of conditions, a state of unlivability that makes people question what the larger political project is, that is then questioning what is happening in the U.S., what is being exported from the U.S. And so that's why I wanted to bring this document up and share. And so before we move on to another round of questions, I wanted to because in the spirit of having a round table, I wanted to also give each of you Salifu, Jackie, or Manolo the opportunity to respond to one another, to think with each other, to think about how what is happening between African Stream, Africom, and Cuba help us think about this sort of global fight against anti-imperialism and repression.
Before that, two things. I want to ask Manolo a follow-up question and anybody in the panel could quickly respond. But I dropped a link in the chat to our Google Drive that has this resource that is up on the screen, as well as the BAP fact sheet about Africom and other resources. So that link is in the chat. But Manolo, I wanted to ask you, how does being on the designated a state sponsor of terrorism, how did that exacerbate the already existing blockade? And then anybody else can respond to this as well, because I know that all of you have experience in Cuba and with Cuba.
I mean, Trump designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism literally a few days before leaving the White House. It was like the last fuck you, if I may say, to Cuba on the eve of leaving the White House, as if 243 sanctions in 3 years hadn't been enough, as if even threats of actually a military invasion had not been enough. Cuba gets designated on this list, and the immediate effect is severe because every bank in the world is now forced to revise its trading and its transactions with Cuba. No bank wants to do trade with a country that's on this list. And, you could look at who are the countries that are on this list. It's Iran. It's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's the countries that, in a way represent huge threats to U.S. Hegemony and domination in their parts of the world. And it affects even European tourists. There's a situation now where Europeans who travel to Cuba on vacation, I mean, Europe is one of the biggest markets for tourism to Cuba, can now no longer travel to the US without applying for a visa because of Cuba being on this designation. So, it affects every aspect of Cuban life right now. I mean, life in Cuba has always been hard. It's been 62 years of blockade with shortages, with scarcity, with difficulties. But I've never personally, having lived in Cuba, I've never seen it as hard as it is now. Because imagine simply not even having the money, with Cuba having the money, not being able to pay for a ship of fuel. You have the money in your bank and you cannot pay to buy school books. You cannot buy medicine. It's insane.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I really appreciate Manolo just existing, honestly, because what you just said about Europeans, like Cuba is a vacation destination for Europeans. Like, imagine if we understood that we could go to Cuba and lay on the beach. Right? If we in the United States, we Africans understood that was a possibility, and yeah, it might have been difficult in previous years, but we could have done it. And our material conditions, that's a whole nother conversation. But for those of us who have the ability to do it, imagine if we realized we could do that, and a bunch of us went to Cuba or had been going to Cuba all this time and saw for ourselves what's really going on in Cuba and what Cuba is really like. I can't imagine how different the conversation about Cuba would be among us today, and what our relationship to the Biden administration in particular, which Manolo is right. For people who do not know, that terrorist list designation was done like a day before Trump left office. But you know who didn't do anything with it when he came into the White House? Joe Biden. Even though there were protests at the White House, like after the inauguration, the first official days in the White House, we was out there. If you understand, we were out there demanding take Cuba off the list. Mr. Democratic president, who we're supposed to organize easier under, because remember, that's what everybody said. We have to
push them
vote.
left.
We have to vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris because we can organize more easily. We have more room to, and those of us who are always organizing, we're out there looking around, on the first official day of the Biden administration, like, we don't see no more people out here organizing. We see the folks that we see every year, every day. So all of this extra organizing that was supposed to be done under Biden, of course it didn't get done. Right. And Biden, being the neoliberal, imperialist loving, Cuba hating, socialist hating Democrat that he is, of course he wasn't going to do anything different with that designation, because he wants to continue to destroy all socialist countries, all countries that are opposed to US imperialism and capitalist hegemony. He wants to destroy all of them too. So he continues to go after Cuba, but he also continues to go after Nicaragua and Venezuela. And now we see the AES, all of along with the repression, against the escalating warfare against China and Russia. So it's not just going after one country, it is going after all of the countries that are anti-imperialist, yes, but also all of the countries that would be in solidarity with each other, and providing the material, ideological, and maybe even, if necessary, military support to continue this fight. So the empire is always seeing the situation in its entirety. And I think sometimes those of us on the left, we kind of don't. We put things in silos where the empire is like, yep, we're going to get rid of this whole string of people because they are all connected. And we don't see those connections sometimes.
Two things that I want to add, one on sanctions, one on US imperialism. So Africans are like no stranger to the concept of sanctions, especially with Africa being, the most sanctioned continent. And I think what was really, it's pivoting from African stream for a second and moving into talking a little bit more about the Alliance of Sahel states. During my time in Burkina Faso, it was really interesting to me how much everyday African people there discuss Cuba. So because of the sort of legacy that exists of Thomas Sankara and Fidel Castro, that relationship that exists, the Cuban embassy in Burkina Faso is very popular. It's like very established. And as the development of the Alliance of Sahel states was starting to gain traction, and people were realizing that this thing that they had been proposing and talking about was really sort of beginning to get off the ground. When the sanctions, Mali was sanctioned first, and then when the sanctions were placed on Niger and Burkina Faso, there was so much chatter about how, we're next, it's coming, we need to be prepared for this, it's coming. And so a lot of what the comrades at the Thomas Sankara Center, what we discussed during our study sessions was like a very intense interest in Cuba, because people were really, 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 really interested in understanding the Cuban model and understanding what it was about Cuba that allowed it to withstand sanctions for all this time. And that interest has grown, and it's really gotten really, really, really intense, to such an extent that our comrades do have plans to travel and visit Cuba this year, because they want that rigorous socialist education. They really want to understand, sort of what it is that has kept this small nation, afloat throughout all of these years of U.S. aggression. And then on the point of U.S. imperialism, I think that there has been this assumption for a very long time when it comes to the Sahel states, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, that there's just this sort of tunnel vision focus on France, like France. Like clearly these Africans don't understand primary contradiction. What I'm saying? They don't really understand US imperialism, but they do. And I think like one of the most satisfying sort of interactions that I had is I got woken up really early one morning to get on a bike and go to this protest that was happening outside the US embassy, where there was this organization that was protesting outside the US embassy, and they came to deliver a letter to the embassy basically saying like, France was first and you're next. And we are waiting on we await your departure. You will leave. And in the process of you leaving, like any attempt that you make to meddle in the affairs of the alliance, the people will not stand for it. Like, you don't have to worry about Traore or eBay, as they call him. Like, you don't have to worry about eBay. You don't have to worry about the military government or the junta, as you like to call it. Like, it will be the people that will come here and shut this thing down. And it was really, 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 really inspiring to me. And I always want to talk about it to explain to people that around the world, people are awake and alive to this concept of contradictions. Like, they've just sharpened themselves to such a high point. Like, people were standing outside talking about how the US is this great evil, and they're connecting the struggle that they're dealing with there to the struggle in Palestine. They're talking about Libya, they're talking about Haiti, they're talking about Cuba. So there's all this energy that exists at the grassroots level in the AES. And I think one thing that the US is severely underestimating right now is how its sort of policy stance and its stature, its posture around the world is pushing people in the directions that it doesn't want people to go. So in Burkina Faso, you're seeing a reignition. Again, this is not African Stream. This is not about African Stream. This is about the Alliance of Sahel States. You're seeing a reinvigorated relationship with North Korea. You're seeing people, that's why you see people wave these flags of Russia. You're seeing a mended relationship between Burkina Faso and Iran. These things are happening because of, in spite of, the way that the US is moving around the world, not out of some manipulation, not out of some, these dumb Africans, they're just running from one master to the next, but people are really thinking strategically in a landlocked country where we know we are about to face serious global repercussions from the international community. What other options do we have? And so I always want to put that out there because I wish people would discuss these things with a little bit more grace, humility and understanding in terms of, sanctions are real. They're, like Manolo said, they're a form of warfare. And so in response, people want to do anything that they can to be prepared to navigate that.
Salifu, there are several different things that kind of came to my mind when you were sharing those examples. And one, I wish I was trying to find it as you were talking, but I remember Chucho Garcia did a documentary when Chavez came to power, one of the things that the Venezuelan government did under the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela was either expand or renormalize diplomatic relations with numbers of African countries, right? But Mali in particular had this like school village that had been named, I can't remember if it was either after Chavez or after Bolivar, but part of that relationship was trying to solidify these kinds of South-South exchanges in terms of what it means that we are not looking to the US, we are not looking to Europe, we're not looking to the Imperial West as examples for like who we are, right? And I know you keep going back to saying that you're not necessarily talking about African Stream, but I think what's important about African Stream in this conversation is that having an independent news media outlet that is allowed to determine what stories are useful for us as people, right? What stories are countering particular kinds of narratives. And even if we don't necessarily always agree with, we can have all kinds of debates about what it means to have a military coup be the reason why a new regime comes into power and the sustainability of all those things. We can have all those kinds of debates, but I think the important thing is that they are debates for us to have for ourselves as people, right? And they are not debates that should be that should be manipulated and or silenced or hushed because of other kinds of interests. And I think to the last point that you were making, something that I have experienced in Venezuela, I've experienced it in Cuba, but I've also experienced it on the African continent, that I do think, like I remember when I was in a fellowship program in South Africa, I remember distinctly like the different level of political conversation about the world, the different level of information about the world, right? A global sort of left understanding of what is happening. And then not that everybody agreed with it, but even that it was a part of the conversation, part of the dialogue and debate. And I do remember that being very distinct from what I experienced, one on the streets in the US, but two, particularly in the US Academy, right? And so like having been able to be in those spaces, and being able to be challenged. I think, Salifu, like you particularly mentioned about what it means for you to be coming from the US and have a particular angle on the story, as opposed to folks who have either lived on the continent or elsewhere in the so-called global South. I think that's really important for us to always kind of bring out, right? Because we live in the US. I remind my students of this all the time. Like, sometimes, use your little VPN, because what we're even able to get access to here in the US is really controlled and curtailed by what the US government wants us to see and what kinds of stories they want us to promote. And African Stream was and continues to try to be one of those outlets that allows us to have different perspectives. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
I just quickly want to throw in, y'all already know, Walter Rodney quote. What you were saying, Salifu, Rodney had this particular quote. He said, "When I was in Jamaica in 1960, I would say that already my consciousness of West Indian society was not that we needed to fight the British, but that we needed to fight the British, the Americans, and their indigenous lackeys. That I see as an anti-neo-colonial consciousness, as distinct from a purely anti-colonial consciousness." So we be knowing. Jackie, Manolo, your any more about this conversation before we ask another question?
No, I just think I want to ask Manolo, how do we help? Because I love when we're able to bring the truth and the inside perspective outside of the site of struggle. And as much as we believe that our leftist community here in the US is pretty, whatever we believe about them, I always find myself having to be the one to ask, okay, but what do we do though? Right? It's like, thank you for telling me, but I know people are listening and watching and saying, how do we help? How do we help this? How do we help these people? So that's what I want to know. How can we help Cuba right now?
But can I just add to this question, Jackie? So there's organizations, specifically organizations geared toward like Black Cubans on the continent, like Red Barrial Afrodescendiente. And so can you say a bit about what actually is happening on the ground? And then how can we help? How can we sort of lift up what's already going on?
Well, I think that there's things that we need to be doing in the immediate, in the medium term, and in the long term. But the reality is that on the island, as we speak, I think there's, both the process of recovery of the power grid, which is like the urgency that the country is geared towards. There is the recovery from the Hurricane Oscar, which is, as we speak, still, this hurricane was supposed to have left already, and it's still sort of circling around in eastern Cuba, affecting actually historically Black communities in the East. As always, as of yet, we haven't heard of any loss of life, because that is always a priority for Cuba's civil defense, to evacuate everyone. People don't actually get a choice. There's a saying in Cuba that if you have to arrest someone in order to save them, the state is empowered to do that. So that's an element of what's happening right now. But I think there is the long-term process, which is, in a sense, what many organizations led by the Communist Party in Cuba are doing, which is that in times of asymmetrical war, in times in which your enemy is pounding you day after day and basically trying to break the unity of the masses by any means necessary, the social net, the social framework, the social unity of the people has to be strengthened. And that has to be done both by dealing with the contradictions that exist among the people, but also by strengthening the organizational capacity of the people. And I think the Communist Party, the Federation of Cuban Women, the Committees in Defense of the Revolution do this, but also there are many organizations that are not official party organizations, like the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, that do this incredible work of dealing with the contradiction of the remnants of racism that remain in Cuba. I mean, it's something that not everyone likes to talk about, but racism is a reality in Cuba. It's a remnant of a society based in colonialism for over 500 years. But you have a society that for the first time since 1959 is trying to deal with it head on, with many mistakes led by human beings, but it is trying to deal with this head on. And you have a situation where the leaders of the Red Barrera Afrodescendiente get to sit down with the president and criticize the leadership of the Communist Party and advise and say, you're focusing too heavily on this line. You need to actually think about the problem this way. And this is happening not just from the Red Barrera Afrodescendiente. Young activists are meeting with the president on a regular basis, all across sectors of society. Women, students, the problem of domestic violence continues to be a major contradiction in Cuba today. And machismo and sexism. There's a commission of women leaders from across the country that are constantly meeting with the president and the leadership of the Communist Party on these issues. And I think ultimately that is what is going to help defeat from the inside all the threats of US imperialism, because what the US has not been able to figure out in 62 years of war against Cuba is how to break the back of the Cuban people. They have not figured out that the Cuban people have a desire, like all Maroons have, which is to die free. We are all going to die, but the question is, will we die free? And the Cuban people have figured that one out. What can we do here in the belly of the beast is an important question as well. In the immediate short term, we have a responsibility, not just on Cuba, but with what's happening to Africa Stream, what's happening on the African continent itself, which is to denounce. We actually have to denounce this nonsense, this barbarity every day. And I appreciate journalists like Jackie Lukman and so many others, what Dr. CBS is doing, what Dr. Leila Brown is doing, what Sarif was doing, to basically raise consciousness about this. That is the most immediate task. In the medium term, we have to actually push on questions of policy. While this evil corporate imperialist government remains, we have to push where there are contradictions that exist within the system. And we actually, on the question of Cuba, need to keep pushing on getting Cuba removed from this list of state sponsors of terrorism. Ending the blockade will require more legal work because the right-wing gusanos from Miami, most of them white racists, white supremacists, made it so that the blockade is codified into congressional law. But the state sponsors of terrorism list can be changed by the president and the State Department. That is actually an easier thing to do. So that's a medium-term task. And lastly, which is the long-term task, there will always be a threat to the Cuban Revolution. There will always be a threat to the people of the Sahel. There will always be a threat to peace on this planet as long as US imperialism exists. And US imperialism has no plan to go anywhere unless people are organized to defeat it inside the belly of the beast. It is past time being a good revolutionary online. It is past the time to raise flags online. It is past the time to say we believe that one country is good and another is bad. It's time to actually organize. And that is hard work because it means talking to the people. It means dealing with the people and their contradictions and how difficult our own people can be at times. But we have to organize with them, not for them, not by them, with them. And that is our task here in the United States. That's what these times require, mass movements that can ultimately defeat imperialism.
Yeah, I want to just throw Gaza in here, right? Because because we are talking about Africa, I want to talk about Gaza. I want to talk about Lebanon and the Middle East and this whole framework of anti-Blackness that has been used in a sense to try to undermine the Cuban Revolution, for example, that has been used as a reason to not support Gaza and Palestinian liberation, that has been used as a means of not support Lebanon, because there was some reports that came out about how in Lebanon, for example, the domestic servants of Lebanese folks who are primarily African, but also Filipino, also I think from maybe not Singapore, anyway, from other parts of South Asia, but they were left behind, right? That they were either locked in the home or left behind, and that this is a function of anti-Blackness. And so I want to bring up, I don't want us to be having the conversation about Africa, Haiti, Cuba, etc., apart from the conversation about Gaza. And so I want, in you all's as anti-imperialists, as revolutionary Africans, how are you thinking about these things together? And then how do we what I have my own response, right? But how do we lift up the fact that yes, there is within the global South different antagonisms among racialized and colonized people, but still keep our anti-imperialist politics, even when there is anti-African bias, what we might call anti-Blackness, etc. Like, how do we hold all of these things together?
Well, just by way of an added intervention, as you all are thinking about what you might want to respond to that, because it's interesting. I watched, y'all know my dad is our unofficial research assistant, and he's always sending me stuff, right? And so just this morning, I was watching like two different stories. One this terrible, like almost like kind of hit piece on Al Jazeera about the mass exodus of Venezuelans, right? And they interviewed like 3 youth, one of whom I know, who was really, I could tell, was kind of carefully trying to toe a line, but the interview was very skewed, trying to think about, why are people leaving the country, right? But I think even in this question of Cuba, I imagine that many of us either on this call or in the chat have also been invited to this conference that is scheduled to take place in December. Hopefully, devastation not pending, it will continue. It will happen in December, where the Cuban government is attempting to have a forum to talk directly about issues of race and anti-Blackness in a way that it has not always necessarily been open to historically, which again is not a direct, as Manolo pointed out earlier, is not really a direct byproduct of the Cuban Revolution, but it is particular to the kind of history of anti-Blackness that comes out of the sort of colonization of Latin America, right? The particular way that the Catholic Church understands race and racial mixture. And so you see it in all of the Spanish, French, and Portuguese speaking territories in somewhat of a different way than you see in the sort of, Protestant, English speaking territories. But I wanted to kind of throw that in there as some of the ways that I think both the Cuban government acknowledges that it needs to, take this issue up in a way that perhaps even the kind of mainstream Communist Party did not, right? These are some of the issues that a lot of the Black members of the Communist Party were taking, having with the Communist Party because of the way they were dealing, particularly with the question of race and anti-Blackness, right? And so again, I just wanted to add that to the conversation as you all think about how to answer, how do we hold those tensions and also, recognize where we need to keep our support and keep our, our criticisms.
This has been a really interesting kind of conversation for me because for the longest time, because I had not read Wilderson's book, and so I did not know what the hell people were talking about when they were saying Afro-pessimism for like a year. I'm like, what are they talking about? And then I try to look up the definition for it, and it's like, say what now? What? And so I try to listen to conversations about it, and it's everybody has a different understanding, and I just really had to go back to my basic anti-imperialism 101. What is the primary contradiction? Anti-Blackness is not the primary contradiction. I don't ever want to say that it doesn't exist. I don't ever want to say that there is not a general, and I won't even say among an entire society, because I understand where it comes from. It comes from the primary contradiction, which is colonialism or settler colonialism or, capitalism or imperialism. But it is not the primary contradiction. Some groups of people are more susceptible in that. Now we're talking about class, right? Now we're talking about a class issue. And then we're talking about compradors, people who may or may not accept the idea of racial antagonism, but to benefit their own pockets, they're cool with trafficking in it, right? So to me, the conversation about anti-Blackness or racism or white supremacy in formerly colonized countries is almost a red herring. It's almost like we are not talking about the thing that we in the beating heart of the empire need to be focused on. Because if we can't keep this country from killing all of the people in that country, I don't think while they're being, denied electricity and bombed, genocided out of existence, I don't think their blackness is an issue for in that moment of asymmetrical warfare or outright, kinetic warfare against their countries. Is there a moment in time for those issues to be dealt with? Absolutely. And I'm glad that we talked about Cuba and this conference coming up, because Cuba is the example, and it's just one example, it's not even the only example of these kinds of societies that do experience this kind of lingering legacy of white supremacist settler colonialism, and how they respond to it. And what we should be doing is looking at this society and saying, well, what are they doing over here? Whatever we bring up racist police terrorism, what does this government say? As opposed to when Afro-Cubans say to the Cuban government, listen, we're not being treated fairly because we're Black and we're sick of it. And the Cuban government's response is, you know what, you're right. Tell us what to do. Let's sit down, talk about it, let's work it out. But what do we get? We get the round table on 20th century policing from Barack Obama. That is literally a little notebook with some recommendations that got put into a closet somewhere and is now collecting dust because it wasn't policy, it wasn't law, it didn't change anything. It didn't require the police to do anything different in regard to how it treats Black, poor, working class, oppressed folks, marginalized folks, right? So I don't like getting into this conversation about anti-Blackness in other countries. I don't like talking about Russian anti-queer. Look, it's not that these things don't exist, because every society has these social schisms, because we've all been subjected to some anti-human capitalist imperialist propaganda and indoctrination. We all have been. Some countries that have liberated themselves from that are better at addressing those issues internally than this country ever will be. And that's really just kind of where I leave it. And I know people don't like that, but I'm just like, listen, man, I trust queer people in Russia to deal with the policies they don't like in Russia. If they want our help, we are here, right? When they ask for our help, and we have to follow their lead in how they want us to assist them. But what I find us doing very often is exactly what you said, Layla, is we use these internal issues as a way to discredit people's revolutions against imperialism, which I'm never going to participate in that kind of bullshit, because we don't have time for that shit. So
can I say this real quick? Because then I'm gonna have to go to band practice. If I don't, these kids gonna kill me. On the subject of Palestine, I just want to say real quickly, I'm 10 toes down with the struggle in Palestine by any means necessary, by all means necessary. I have no criticisms to leverage at what is happening in West Asia, North Africa right now. I just feel like when it comes, ideology matters. Ideology is important. I'm gonna do my best to not be dismissive in what I'm saying right now, because similar to Jackie, I feel like I can have a very abrasive approach when it comes to this kind of thing. The polite way to say this is, okay, I'm a Pan-Africanist, right? So ideology, I'm a Pan-Africanist and I'm a socialist. So ideology is important to me. So when I say I'm a Pan-Africanist, I'm saying I believe in the total liberation of Africa under scientific socialism, right? Total liberation, unification. So my question then becomes, as a person for whom Africa is primary, why do Africans have to leave Africa to work elsewhere? On this question of Lebanon and domestic service workers. Sure, we can deal with the surface issue, which is that, you know, rich people left behind their help, regardless of color. Rich people, class politics, left behind their help in the situation of warfare. Okay, yes. But we still are not dealing with the question of why are Africans having to leave our homes to work in other places. That, for me, is the primary issue. So colonialism is my enemy. Neocolonialism is my enemy. Settler colonialism is my enemy. The struggle in Palestine right now, currently, is like at the forefront of antagonizing and destabilizing my direct enemies. So I'm gonna hold that there for a second. I may not like, you know, certain treatment or things that may happen in other places, but in terms of what is strategic, what is actionable, what is necessary, what aligns with the ideology that I hold, right? My best shot is trying to figure out why is it that you must leave Mauritania? Why is it that you must leave Senegal? Why is it that you must leave Nigeria? Why is it that you must leave Ghana? I want to deal with these issues on the African continent. And for people who are really involved in sort of that study and that work, we literally understand that is the result of European colonialism. So that is what I want to deal with. And I'm not really interested in like how I'm perceived or whether people like me or whether people want to marry me or date me. Like these are like very second class issues to me. I'm talking about like liberating all of Africa. And I feel like people do not deal with Pan-Africanists in a serious way. I think it's because a lot of people consider Pan-Africanism to be like Umar and them or whatever. So like they just think about us as like identity obsessed people, and like you again going back to questions of like who you're married to and your dating politics and all these kind of things. But like I'm when I talk about Pan-Africanism, I'm talking about like an objective which would change the global world order. If Africa was united from imperialism and colonialism and it was liberated and socialist, none of this is going to matter. We're not going to have conversations about people doing domestic work in Lebanon. We're not going to be having conversations about reparations in the United States or police brutality. This has the potential to change the entire order of the world as we know it. Like the implications of the way the world would change if Africa was free, liberated, like, and united, it goes beyond what most of us can comprehend. So like, that's where I have to keep my like serious sort of focus and energy. And I respect that people want respect for Black people throughout the world and in other places where we are. It's not our fault that we're in all these different places. And a lot of times we've been trafficked to these places, or, you know, we have to leave. But I want to deal with that root issue. And so whenever I hear the anti-Blackness brigade like get up on their soapboxes and things like that, I just want to hold their hands and be like, there's a solution for the thing that you're angry about, but do you actually want to engage with it? And that's just where I'm at right now.
What a note to go to band practice on.
Yeah,
I just want to say real quick that if whomever is trying to date you, if we don't get a dossier on this person, it ain't gonna happen. So you can't be saying that kind of stuff to me. What's wrong?
But did you see Jackie's face when you were making that comment? She was like, hold on now.
I was like,
what are we talking about?
What their name is? How come this the first we hear?
Basilifu, thank you so much. And thank you for that mic drop on your way to band practice. Manolo, do you want to weigh in?
I mean, I feel like Jackie and Salifu kind of covered it, but I think the only thing I would add is that I think public opinion in the US, which is so heavily influenced by what the US government wants public opinion to be, has shifted the debate from what the civil rights revolutionaries created, which is like a materialist analysis of what racism was as a structure, to talking about people's individual actions as a matter of anti-Blackness, is the most liberal and postmodern framework that we could possibly have. What value does it have for us to discuss what one person does and completely ignore actual structures of anti-blackness that exist in our world today. And to me, there's nothing more anti-black than the US funded war in Ukraine. Because this US funded war in Ukraine is preventing the countries in Africa from purchasing wheat at fair prices. This war has raised the prices of food all across the African continent. It has made the lives of millions of Black people much more difficult. Mm-hmm. But who will get up online on a public stage and say that is anti-Black? No, because it's so convenient to put, in these days, a Palestinian flag and a Ukrainian flag in your thing and say, you're for independence and liberation, whatever. To me, the most anti-Black thing was the way the COVID vaccines were produced in the United States. Mm. Designed from the beginning to the end to not be able to be used on the African continent. In fact, the only country on the planet who designed a pro-Black vaccine was Cuba, because they designed it to be able to be used without refrigeration and to be applied without having to have a medical degree. To me, that is where the differences between pro-Black, anti-Black stand in our world. We are being told constantly, yes, those people, one journalist in Gaza says something disparaging about Blacks. Yes, he did. But I also know that the material forces of Palestinian society ultimately stand with the liberation of not just Palestine, but of the African continent. And they stand with the African diaspora on the majority of things. But my friends, we also know our own people say horrible things about not just other Black people, but about other groups of people on the planet. Does that mean that African people do not deserve liberation or self-determination? Once we get into that postmodern road, there's no end to it.
It reminds me of that quote by Kwame Ture. If you want to kill me, that's your problem. If you have the power to kill me, that's my problem. Now, I don't want to reduce anti-Blackness just to that, though, right? Just to the idea that people are mean to me or people don't like me. So here's the thing. If it is that imperialism, and in this case, U.S. imperialism is the primary contradiction, right? And if it is that super exploitation is the political economy of imperialism, and super exploitation is oppression plus exploitation, and that oppression generally falls along racialized and colonized lines, then we must admit that racial oppression there is a material reality to that. Super exploitation, expropriation, and extraction accrue around racialized bodies, period. And this is why if you go to a garrison in Jamaica, a favela in Brazil, right? A Bantustan in Johannesburg, a ghetto in the US, it is dark-skinned people who are there and who are concentrated there. And so I don't want us to just I use the term anti-Black racial oppression just to matrix my concept from the ontological, but I don't want us to minimize the fact that dark-skinned Black, right, African, or people who can be construed as such through stereotype or through like myth making, there is an inordinate amount of surplus value that is extracted from those people. And out of that imperative comes the whole superstructure, if you will, but the whole nexus of social relations. And so I want us to take that seriously as well. But that is a type of that, to me, that's the way it needs to be structured, not through the mumbo jumbo that we see pervading online.
And I think that taking it seriously, not in the US, right, but the taking it seriously is, at least in a few of the examples that we talked about, right? Again, I think Manolo has acknowledged this. I acknowledge this even with doing work in Venezuela. It is a wholly incomplete project in dealing with African peoples in these respective countries, right? But what I think we keep seeing over and over and over again is the choice to say, if we are going to struggle on this terrain, this is the set of people that we want to struggle with over these things, right? Because it's not a new thing that we have been oppressed as African people in Cuba, in Venezuela, in the US, in wherever, right? It is not some particular manifestation of a socialist or socialist adjacent government coming to power that makes anti-Blackness more structurally rampant, right? It is that it already exists in the sort of psyche, in the structure of the society, and that there again is an incomplete project where the new order is trying to come in and deal with these things, right? And so like that's why we see, you know, I mean, to some of the points that Manola made, right? Like the pro-Blackness, if you will, of the formulation of Cuba's vaccine, right? If we think about some of the early programs in the under the Bolivarian Republic, right, to give land titles and deeds to folks living in barrios, right, people who lived on very small plots of land, but to have some sort of ownership, and not in the sort of capitalist sense, but some sort of material relationship to the land that people were living on that had been forbidden by previous structures, right, does create a different way of being, right? Or to have established these commissions that actually allow for the development of a robust education program that then does say, yes, you know, all these Black people in the DR are not Tainos. Some of them might be, but they are not all. The vast majority of them are brown and Black because of their African ancestry, right? But there are structural reasons why people hold that belief, because they have been educated to believe that, like, there is no history of teaching about the history of the European slave trade, the illegal trafficking of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean by Europeans. There is no comprehensive long history of teaching about that in most Latin American countries in the way that it exists in the United States. And it has only been becoming so in the past decade or so, right? And so again, I think that it's a question of like who you get to struggle with and on what terrains are you struggling with. And I think that that's the conversation that we're having, right? And that's the kind of mic drop that Salifu had. It's not that these are not real issues that need to be addressed, right? But it is that we have to remember that they cannot become our reasons for saying, oh, well, fuck communism, fuck socialism, fuck Cuba, fuck Venezuela, because they just as anti. But no, it's not just as. there is a relative difference, I think. And I think that has to be acknowledged, right? And that's not to, you know, to diminish any kind of thing, but I do think that those particularities have to be a part of the conversation to have a genuine conversation.
So how do we do that? And I'm being, I guess, Americocentrist, but in the context of the United States where race is supreme, right? And anti-Black racial oppression is a sort of, it reigns heavy in all of our understandings of oppression and repression, right? How do you use political education, or how do you push past this idea, well, they hate Black people, so we not fucking with them, which I think is actually a rational response. If all of the people who hate Black people are the people who have you living in rat and roach infested housing, who have you in a food desert, who have you with no health care, and at the sort of bottom of every health indicator, how do you then say to ordinary people, like, no, what is happening in Southwest Asia matters to your reality in real terms? And when sort of there is that reality, right, that you're pointing out, there is that reality of anti-African bias or whatever. Like what do you say, like what in real time, or what are the types of things that you all are doing in your organizations to still galvanize people?
Well, I think you already pointed to part of the answer. I think you all have, which is that a lot of this is unlearning, but more importantly, going deep into our own history. For me, there's never been a more profound moment of unlearning than when you read as an Afro-Caribbean person, the history of colonialism in our region. And you learn how at the same time that we were a territory in dispute for both US and European imperialism, the people of the Philippines, the people of Guam, were facing similar racialized forms of terror, that they were facing similar threats of imperialism, and that, in fact, in those times, our people understood that they had to fight together. That in my territory, in my little island of the world, where people still use categories, racial categories like coffee with milk to describe themselves.
Wait, where are you from?
I'm Dominican.
Oh shit. Okay, yeah. Go off, brother.
Where we people talk, we talk in this way, but only 100 years ago, all of our struggles for liberation were funded, organized, and supported by the Haitian people. That we owe our sense of identity of who we are as a people to Haiti. We have to unlearn and we have to go back into history, because history reveals more than what our enemies want us to know. History, in fact, reveals that there is a complicity between all oppressed people. And I didn't want to say this before, but I will say it now. I have very little sympathy for the rich ladies of Beirut who leave their maids behind, because I have very little sympathy for the rich ladies and the rich sirs, gentlemen of any country or any city in the world. But I have the most profound sympathy, the most profound sense of identification with the children, the grandchildren of people in Korea who, until 100 years ago, were considered slaves and inferior racial beings by the Japanese. Those are my people. My people are the Sahrawis. My people are the Palestinians. My people are the people who everywhere on this planet have been considered lower than low. We all have something in common. You go to any bar, you know this because you've traveled. You go to any bar in the world and you talk about these things, and people know exactly what you're talking about.
And they buy you drinks.
They look at you and they might even cry and laugh with you at the same time, because they know exactly what you're talking about. They may not know where Chicago or Detroit or Mississippi is, but they know exactly what you've been gone through, because it's their story too. And that is something that postmodernism, that neoliberalism, that society with its hoteps and its preachers and its doctors who try to tell us everything the opposite want to hide. We have to unearth that.
Ooh, don't get me started on the preachers. Don't get me started on the damn preachers. but I just want to say that the thing that I think the thing that helped me was learning about a little bit, and I haven't even gone deep into the rabbit hole, deep into the history like I love to do, because I just haven't had time. But learning about the struggle in the Philippines, like starting with the United Fruit Company, and something as innocuous as bananas for breakfast, and not even realizing that the fact that we eat bananas at all, but the fact that we associate bananas with breakfast in particular, is the result of US capitalist propaganda to support the expansion of plantations in the Philippines to grow bananas so we could have bananas, for literally creating a capitalist market on the exploitation of the Filipino people, because they set up plantations, right? So I'm reading this history of the United Fruit Company, and I come across the word plantation, and I'm like, oh crap, wait, they have plantations too. Is it the same kind? So you do your scientific, what do they mean when they say plantation? Do they mean the same thing that I'm familiar with? And you go there and it's like, oh yeah, they do mean the same thing. It is pretty much the same thing. If it's not, straight using the Filipino people as chattel, it's definitely holding them in servitude, because
there's a reason why the Filipinos are the blacks of the Asians.
And see, you don't even have to go that far. Like, that's the thing I think I realized, man, I don't even have to go that deep into history to see the connections between the struggle for African liberation, both on the continent and throughout the diaspora, and also understanding why the African diaspora is as big as it is, right? And that comes from the primary contradiction of European human trafficking of Africans, right? But also, you don't have to go that deep into history to expose the connections that we have between the struggle for African liberation and the struggle for liberation of other racialized, colonized, oppressed people. And then when you see that, then you realize, oh, this is the result of the othering of all non-European people. And what is the statement? There's levels to this shit, you know. And I always think of like the description of hell in Dante's Inferno, where you've got this inverted cone and you've got these levels of suffering and depression. And that's how I think of, in a weird kind of way, that's just how my brain works. That's how I think of the way racialized people are oppressed or have been oppressed throughout the history of European colonization of the world. Yes, we've all been oppressed by these people, but I think there are levels to it. And I think that is where we see the different, I don't think responses, but the different ways that some groups of racialized people are more easily incorporated into the system of oppression to uphold it. Right. And then we understand that's a class issue, not necessarily a race issue. But then we also can see from that how, from this hierarchy of oppression, how these racist sentiments of darker people, even among oppressed people, can be easily imposed on marginalized, oppressed people. So it really is, Manolo's right. It really is history. Learning the history really is the answer to understanding that it's racialized oppression, but it's levels to this shit. So yeah.
A profound unlearning. That is what I appreciate and take away from, obviously there's much more that we take away from this conversation, but I really appreciate that as just sort of a framing. We both want to thank you. So obviously this conversation could go on and on and on, and we would love for it to go on and on and on, but we have to be respectful of ours and your time. So hopefully, hopefully we would be able to converse with one another under better circumstances, but we may invite you all back. But we also thank you for being here today and sharing with us your knowledge, your experiences, and for helping us to sort of frame and think about what it is that we're struggling against and what it is that we're actually trying to build. So we want to thank you again for coming today.
No,
Thanks, both. Thank you so much.
All right. So, all right. Well, safe travels wherever y'all are and whatever you're doing. And we will talk to you soon.
Take care, Manolo.
Bye. Shoo.
All right,
y'all.
Hope you enjoyed that. Some big questions that we are engaging. What was that? An interview extravaganza. Now we don't have to do no more for the rest of the season. I'm just kidding. We definitely have more coming up. But so what do we just have our life updates left?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's really it. And which is not much, yeah.
Yeah, do we and to read the comments, but do we want to go through any of these? Y'all was getting it in the chat. Y'all don't gotta read all that, but okay.
I think maybe they're just one other thing. So one other thing that we did not share was just a quick fact sheet about Cuba, which I think a lot of it came up in the conversation already, but just to put it up, it is shared in the shared drive, and I think a couple of you all requested, but we wanted to just put some of these things up here. Oh, I wanted to ask Manolo even more about the 85% of the island having power back already, but didn't.
He said 85% of Havana.
Oh, Havana. Okay.
Yeah.
Havana. So just wanted to share these. The cost of the blockade is equivalent to the financing necessary to meet the requirements of the country's national list of essential medicines during 1 year. the cost of 25 days of blockade. The cost of 9 days of blockade is equivalent to finding the financing required. Is equivalent to the financing required to import the amount of medical disposables, cotton swabs, gauze, syringe needles, sutures, catheters, serum equipment, among other inputs, and reagents necessary to cover the needs of the national health system during 1 year. I don't have to read all of these. Again, I share these, but I think it's interesting to see, not just interesting, but it's important to see, to put the actual material cost of the blockade into perspective and to really have a sense of what otherwise can be done with these resources, and what is being, controlled and inhibited through the process of the blockade. So we wanted to also make sure that information is shared as well, in the shared drive that you all should have access to. And if you don't, just request it and we'll grant you.
Sorry, I was reading this. Yeah, and shout out to Musa Springer for sending those graphics. Musa, yes, and follow Musa on everything if you can find them, because they are like a mainline Musa on Cuba. So right. This is what I was laughing at. I guess it'll be once a week, Jackie perchance twice a week, and Manolo 0 times a week. This is a near failable amount of the medicine I need. What do I have to say to get my PCP to strengthen? Bro, I've been meaning to ask fucking Dre, who is Curtis?
I was wondering who Curtis was in the chat too.
Keep saying fuck Curtis. This is an inside joke I'm not privy to. Who the fuck is
But was
Curtis?
Dre the person last week that was also saying fuck? It was 2 people in the chat. It was dang, I can't remember who it was. I don't know. There was something that kept coming up in the chat too. It was 2 particular people that they were like, fuck these 2 people in the chat last week too. I can't remember.
I don't remember that. No, it's like who y'all was in the meeting. Oh God. Is that like both of y'all? Oh, y'all missed BLM Friday. Y'all.
That's another thing we have to announce, CBS, that we are officially. So BLM, Black Liberation Media, has decided not to create a new channel. So
they didn't even know that. Yeah, they didn't need to know all that.
Oh well, but that was but we announced that there was some back and forth about why we were delaying moving over, and so now that that has been resolved, we will officially be housed on the BLM platform from here out. The decision was made before the show today, but we had already shared the link for today, so we didn't want to confuse people. But do look for us there as we go forward, and we'll share the link every week as usual.
Yeah, so we'll still have our LSR social media, but from now on, we will not be doing it on this channel. We'll be on BLM exclusively. No. I think, because we can't post the 2 things. So maybe we'll have clips on this, but we'll just be on BLM. So just go to BLM.
The point is reunited, and it feels so good. We are working together to have a collective vision for what it is, for what this process of profound unlearning will be, right? Hopefully that is what our shared commitment is across the platform. And that is what we are trying to, do through our work. And so we will, be there and not here.
Yeah. So we'll remind y'all, but BLM from here on out. Woo, woo, woo.
And I guess just briefly, our personal updates.
Wait, the comments.
Oh, yeah.
So we have from Librarian said, just finished the replay and I would love more 2+ hour shows. Well, we getting there today. We at 1 hour, 33 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we doing okay. Okay.
One Black Anthropy. It's really awesome to listen to the 2 of you share your knowledge of the work you study and do for a living. Thank you kindly.
Mr. Piece of Work said, the part about Hispaniola at the end got me wondering what other islands are divided like that. Not many and no big ones in the Western Hemisphere other than Hispaniola.
No, it's not in the Western Hemisphere for sure.
None that I could think of. Shit, except Turtle Island.
Yeah, well, that was what I was going to say. How big do you want to go with the island?
Right.
Yeah. And then the last one is from Mr. Piece of Work. I nodded off after I started this. Sorry, what were y'all reading around 117? I don't know. Was that the I don't know if that was the Secretary or the.
It was a Secretary.
Okay.
Oh no, maybe it was a Leonard Peltier. You're right.
Yeah, because we did a lot of reading last week, so
yeah, and we did no reading this week.
This is not a shady response; it's actually a genuine response. That is indeed what Rewind is for. So, because I really
don't be falling asleep. That was a shady response. Don't be falling asleep during our shit, brother.
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, all right, now on to our updates.
Okay, so my updates is funny because we had this big thing about grief last week that I was talking about, and my grandmother, my father's mother, who is 95, was put into palliative care yesterday, the day before yesterday, and so at this point, we are, kind of imminently awaiting her, her death. I will say that for my grandmother, she's 95. She has maintained her faculties, and really her mental and her physical faculties for the most part up until the very end. She hasn't really been on solid food for about the past month, and so at this point, it's just kind of like a waiting game because she's just kind of lost the will to eat. But what I will say, I've been thinking a lot about like what it means to give permission to people to go, to let go. I think, when people have done the kind of work of caring for people, and I think letting go has to happen on both sides. But it's just something interesting to think about, because a lot of times those of us who are on the side where we get to stay a little bit longer, sometimes we think selfishly about our lives without these people. And I think, it has given me a lot of peace to think about people not being in pain anymore. People just, I think about the amount of pain like my grandmother was, my mother's mother was in when she passed in 2011. And just some of the happy things, like, my grandmother that's passing now, but her 95th birthday was back in July, and we had a big family thing, and she got to see almost everybody. I remember my maternal grandmother, when she passed in 2011, we had a big celebration of her birthday that year, and everybody kind of came and read cards to her and, expressed to her how much they loved her and appreciated her. And I just think that process of like sharing how we appreciate people while they are alive is just really important. I think we take that for granted until we go through these kind of major grief processes. And I think we just need to think more. We need to be more in that mindset when we are healthy and alive and well and able to tell each other and express to each other, how we care for one another.
Let me just say, I am in a well and healthy mind frame, and if you have the nerve to try to pass away before I'm ready for you to go, you will never rest in peace. I will drag around your desiccated, dry, rotting corpse and will never let you go.
Well, my corpse won't be dry and rotting. My corpse won't be dry and rotting. It will be ashes. Can assure you of that. So you can go visit the sites where it's spread.
You assume.
My daddy, or whoever else is gonna make sure if it's premature, I'll say that.
And if they can fight me. I will abscond with them.
You know what? When my mother had that heart attack, we had this big debate because like my father's family, not my father, my mother's family is religious, right? And so like my grandfather really wanted my grandfather really wanted my mother to be buried. But my mother did not want to be buried. She wanted to be cremated for a lot of different reasons. Like one was kind of silly. She was just like, the thought of being eaten alive by, maggots and worms and whatever else is just weird. But then I think the other is a much more material thing. It's like, when we used to stay on homesteads and stay in cities and stay in places, I think it mattered more to have somebody's body in a cemetery as a material site to visit, as some tangible means of connection. But then, like, as we are forced by capitalism to move in search of jobs, in search of all these other things, we don't have the same kinds of relationships to the land, right? And so we were really like, okay, but if she dies, my mother was from Fayetteville, but if she dies and we bury her in Raleigh, like who might be connected to Raleigh, who's not connected to Raleigh? Will people really come back and visit this site? Whereas like having my mom's ashes feels more meaningful to me than necessarily having a physical site to go back and visit, because my grandmother and my grandfather are physically buried, and I don't know that I've been back to their graves since my grandfather was buried. Whereas I have my mom's ashes sitting on my sitting on my what is that? Oh, you just turn your whole computer
Oh
down.
yeah, because I was looking for my dad's ashes because I had them sitting on my desk and I think they're in the box. No, I got my dad's ashes too. Well, fine, then I guess I'll just roll you up in a blunt and smoke you.
Because nobody best not bury my body in no part of New England. I don't. If you're gonna bury me somewhere, take me back home. And when I mean home, I mean Africa. Yes, take me somewhere. I do not want to be buried in nowhere where it snows. Okay, that would just be an affront to my person.
Well, with global warming, it ain't gonna be snowing nowhere.
That
so
might be true. Fine. And then just let all our ashes float. And then the only other update I had beyond that is that I don't know if I mentioned it, but I am approaching my 3rd year review, my pre-tenure review. Pre-tenure, not 10-year, pre-tenure review. Which means, y'all, that despite all of my angst about writing, I got to get my shit together. And it's funny because I've talked about this a lot, and I kind of feel, because it feels like more pressure now to get things out, I feel like my orientation towards like being able to produce something changed. Like I shared an article with a group of people in my department, and they were like, it's really good. You just need to submit it. And, you know, I don't know if I don't think they're lying, but that's my whole other thing. But I will say that with the impending pressure of either you're going to, you know, get tenure or not, you're going to keep your job or not, I am feeling a little bit more motivated to write. I'll say that, which I thought might happen. But yeah, those are my updates.
But you know, you might be a sprinter, not a marathoner.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
Like you're more, but it's not even about. People think that sprinter means procrastination. It's not that. It's like the way that your motivation and your ideas come together is more focused around closer to a deadline than people who just do a little piece at a time. That's literally just some people's writing style. So that might be yours. Me, y'all, I ain't got no updates. Like except I have a busy week. So I lectured in a class about empire and Black thought earlier. I talked about Claudia Jones. And then after this, so at 7, I'm going to be a discussant for the film Road to Apartheid for the faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine. I have a social justice initiative panel on Saturday, as well as BAP is having our membership meeting, which I'll have to attend virtually because I will be in Cleveland, but I have a panel for that. I have a virtual talk for the Wits School of Social Science and Political Theory on Wednesday.
That's virtual?
Yeah, that's virtual. About Black Scare, Red Scare, and then just a million meetings. So it's a pretty busy week, a packed week. Which is crazy, but it's a lot of talking, a lot of like thinking, which feels a little bit more in like my old configuration, which is nice. So,
and me and my goddaughter had a nice, lovely conversation on this screen before y'all got on. She was talking to me, y'all. This so exciting.
She sure was with her one-word vocabulary. She
it doesn't matter because she doesn't have to say more than one word. We're communicating. I understand. And she smiled immediately when she saw. It was like clear recognition. So
that is true. Like the clear recognition is true. I showed her a picture of you for some reason.
Oh, the one I showed you when I got my hair cut, and I was
not the side profile. Well, yeah, that too. But then I showed her another one, and she was like, So it's exciting for me too that she like is remembering and recognizing like you and my mom and her other grandma and stuff, Biko, or her uncle.
Yeah,
so that's
uncle.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, y'all.
Well, we made it
under 2 hours. Look at us getting it together, sort of.
So obviously we don't have a guest next week, but I think we do have one coming up again soon. So
we're recording for that, but I don't know which episode that will be.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but keep letting us know who y'all want us to have on. You know, of course we can have repeats, but if there's a good book that you've read by preferably a Black person, perhaps we could reach out to them and have them on.
That I think, and also like just in terms of study, right? So like, you know, last week was a more study heavy episode. And so like if it is that there are documents or things that you've read read and engaged with, that maybe you want more context for, or want to like have a more fleshed out discussion, that's also an option. You know, you can email us and be like, oh, like this is, you know, would you all consider discussing this thing on the show? So please do share with us what it is that you would like to see on the show, and we will do our best to be responsive.
Oh, and I did just want to mention Danielle Mejia. We did get your email. Thank you for sending. We didn't want to read it out loud because we didn't know if that was just for us. But thank you for your email and for sending that information. And yeah, y'all can email us anytime with any information you want us to have.
Absolutely.
All right, y'all.
See y'all next week.
I pressed it.